climb, clouds drift by, Brolys fly through a magic sky. Is this real? Are they dreams? Nothing appears to be what it seems. Then far away I can hear a voice in the weather house call out a name. Mr. Brolly, it's time for the rain.
Harry was trying to go to sleep, but no sooner had he closed his eyes than he opened them again. Tucked up beside Harry in bed were his toys, Elephant and Hippo. Snake, as always, lay on the rug by the door, and Bird was perched on the chest of drawers. Harry stared down at his patchwork quilt. It was different from other quilts. Instead of flowery scraps of material, it was made of little embroidered pictures of rainbows, stars and planets, clouds, and great flashes of lightning in a dark and stormy sky. It had been made a long, long time ago. On the wall hung Harry's weather house. If the day was going to be fine and sunny, Mrs. Brolly came to her door. If the day was going to be wet and cloudy, Mr. Brolly came out. But of course, they never came out together, for it is impossible for a day to be both wet and dry at the same time. But what would happen if they both came out together? Wondered Harry, and he sat up and stared at the weather house. As he stared, the doors seemed to grow larger. His bed grew smaller, and he found himself at the entrance of the weather house. A light was shining from the door, through which Harry could see Mr. Brolly no longer fixed to his wooden stand, but moving freely about the room. As Harry entered the weather house, he saw Mr. Brolly doing nothing whatsoever but standing by his workbench and smiling beneath the brim of his hat. "I'm conjuring up the spring, my boy," he said. "Any moment now it will arrive in one glorious burst of flowers, birds and bees. 1, he said. 2, he went on, opening an eye and smiling at Harry. 3. A single flower in a pot suddenly appeared on Mr. Brolly's workbench. It was a very timid-looking little flower, and it hid amongst its leaves like someone who has been awakened too early and who wishes nothing more than to be allowed to snuggle back under their bedclothes. Mr. Brolly picked up the pot plant and looked at it. "And where are the rest of you, eh?" he said. The little flower hung its head. "Please, sir," it said, "they're still asleep, sir. There's only me, sir." It was exactly like a small schoolboy being questioned by a teacher. "You were supposed to be a glorious bunch of blooms, Wilkins," said Mr. Brolly. "However, since there's only you, we must do our best." "Wilkins?" said Harry. "You can't have a flower called Wilkins." At this, both Wilkins and Mr. Brolly turned their heads and looked at him. Harry laughed, for this was one of the nicest things about the weather house, the way that silly and absurd things became quite ordinary, like there being flowers who could speak and who answered to the name of Wilkins. "Come along," said Mr. Brolly. "Wilkins here is going to impersonate a whole bunch of flowers, aren't you, Wilkins? A token of spring to give to Mrs. Brolly." "But it isn't spring, Mr. Brolly," said Harry. "Look." Outside, the garden showed a bleak and icy scene. "My boy, said Mr. Brolly. "This sort of thing will go on forever if one lets it. One must take matters into one's own hands. Help me conjure up the spring." Harry closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he found that he was holding a small rainbow. Mr. Brolly looked at it in silence for a moment. "Well, you tried, my boy," he said, "and that's what matters. It's not the biggest rainbow I've ever seen. It certainly isn't the brightest, but it is a sign of hope." "But, Mr. Brolly," said Harry, "I didn't try. It was just suddenly there." "Well, that's what I like about spring," said Mr. Brolly. "The suddenness of everything. Suddenly there's sunshine. Suddenly there's rain. Suddenly there's a rainbow. And suddenly," he went on, as his hat began to bob up and down on his head, "there's a thundercloud under one's hat." He tried to look pleased about this. "Oh, the silliness of spring," he said, holding on to the brim of his hat. "Leaping lambs, mad March hares." But it was as if his hat had a life of its own. Thunder rolled. Lightning flashed. At last, Mr. Brolly took his hat off. The small black thundercloud sat on his head for a moment, as if wondering what to do. Then it began to roll about the room, looking for the best place in which to have a really good thunderstorm. Being newly made, it found the whole thing very exciting, and it made a great deal of noise, considering what a very small cloud it was. "Blip," it said. "Blop." Mr. Brolly seemed not at all surprised by this. "I'm afraid he's not quite the thing," he said to Harry in a whisper. "He certainly isn't a proper thundercloud." At this, the little thundercloud hurtled across the room, knocked Mr. Brolly's hat to the ground, and threw a small thunderbolt inside. "Blip," it said, and made off to the kitchen with all speed, where Mrs. Brolly was sleeping in her chair. The little thundercloud bounced into Mrs. Brolly's lap and lay there quietly for a moment. "Blippy," it said hopefully. When Mrs. Brolly didn't wake, it drifted up to her shoulder and murmured, "Bloop," softly in her ear. Then it hovered over her head and rained down on her as hard as it could. Mrs. Brolly awoke with a start. At this moment, Mr. Brolly came into the kitchen, carrying Wilkins. "I'm trying to make the spring, my dear," he said, "and I've brought you this lovely flower." Mrs. Brolly sniffed. "Oh, all you've done, Brolly," she said, "is create a small storm cloud, which has thoroughly soaked me and a rather weedy little plant." At this, Wilkins looked very sad, and a tear ran down his petals. "Oh, do buck up, Wilkins," said Mr. Brolly, still hoping that the little flower might become a big bunch of blooms. The little flower seemed to be trying as hard as it could, until the thundercloud dashed across the room and had its noisiest storm yet, all over Wilkins. Wilkins lay down in the pot, now thoroughly soaked. And at this, the little thundercloud fell silent. "Worry," it said. "He says he's sorry," said Harry. Mr. Brolly patted the little cloud absent-mindedly. "There, there," he said. "I accept your apology." "Blop," said the little cloud, and it floated slowly towards Mr. Brolly's hat, which Mrs. Brolly had placed upside down on the kitchen table. But Mr. Brolly did not notice this. "I've tried so many times to make the spring come early," he said. "Once I wrote a letter to every child in the world explaining exactly how it was done, but nothing happened.
Perhaps I forgot to post the letters, or perhaps I merely addressed them wrongly. Who can say?
Dear Mr. Brolly, said Harry, thinking of children all over the world getting letters which they couldn't understand. They sat in silence for a time, and at last Mr. Brolly gave a deep sigh.
My boy, he said, have I forgotten spring? Have I forgotten how to make it?
A tear rolled down his cheek.
No, cried Harry, don't be sad, Mr. Brolly. Try to remember what you put in your letter. What did it say? Why, said Mr. Brolly, it just said, Dear child, whoever you are, and wherever you are.
And then he stopped.
I just can't remember, he said.
Never mind, Brolly, said Mrs. Brolly. Put your hat on and try again another day. Mr. Brolly put on his hat. Water cascaded down over his face and shoulders, but he seemed not to care. Harry and Mrs. Brolly looked at one another, and then they both smiled, and then they giggled, and then everyone began to laugh. Even Wilkins perked up in his pot. Mr. Brolly removed his hat, took out the little thundercloud, and gave it to Mrs. Brolly. "Hurry," it said, as she tucked it away in her bag, where it went to sleep on the patchwork quilt. "You're too impatient, Brolly," said Mrs. Brolly. "The spring doesn't happen all at once."
"But who makes the spring?" asked Mr. Brolly. "Is it you, or is it me?"
"It's both of us," said Mrs. Brolly, putting her arms around him. "We make the spring together."
"Sunshine and showers, tears and laughter. That's what the letter said," cried Mr. Brolly. "Now I remember. It said, Dear child, think of these things. Think of sunshine and love."
And at this, the little flower, sitting in his pot on the table, burst into a whole bunch of blues.
"Oh, well done, Wilkins," said Mr. Brolly. "Well done."
Leaving them happily arm in arm, Harry went to the window, and he saw the winter garden with the bare trees. "Oh, I wish it was spring," he whispered to himself, for the winter had seemed very long. But when he looked again, he saw the tips of green leaves making their way up through the cold, hard ground. "Oh, Mrs. Brolly," he said. But when he turned from the window, he no longer saw Mr. and Mrs. Brolly sitting in their warm kitchen. He was in his own bed, under his patchwork quilt. Raindrops rattled against the window, but a moment later, the sun shone brightly, and first Mr. Brolly and then Mrs. Brolly appeared in turn at the doors of the weather house. Looking at them, Harry smiled, for he knew that spring was now definitely on the way.
Rainbows climb, clouds drift by, Brolys fly through a magic sky. Is this real? Are they dreams? Nothing appears to be what it seems. Then far away I can hear a voice in the weather house call out a name. Mr. Brolly, it's time for the rain.
Harry was trying to go to sleep, but no sooner had he closed his eyes than he opened them again. Tucked up beside Harry in bed were his toys, Elephant and Hippo. Snake, as always, lay on the rug by the door, and Bird was perched on the chest of drawers. Harry stared down at his patchwork quilt. It was different from other quilts. Instead of flowery scraps of material, it was made of little embroidered pictures of rainbows, stars and planets, clouds, and great flashes of lightning in a dark and stormy sky. It had been made a long, long time ago. On the wall hung Harry's weather house. If the day was going to be fine and sunny, Mrs. Brolly came to her door. If the day was going to be wet and cloudy, Mr. Brolly came out. But of course, they never came out together, for it is impossible for a day to be both wet and dry at the same time. But what would happen if they both came out together? Wondered Harry, and he sat up and stared at the weather house. As he stared, the doors seemed to grow larger. His bed grew smaller, and he found himself at the entrance of the weather house. A light was shining from the door, through which Harry could see Mr. Brolly no longer fixed to his wooden stand, but moving freely about the room. Thunder and lightning and heavy showers, followed by fog. Yes, fog. I haven't done fog for a long time. Then he turned, saw Harry, and raised his hat. "Good evening, my boy," he said. "What do you say to fog, eh? Nice, misty, murky, and mysterious fog." And he handed Harry a card, on which was printed the words, "Mr. Brolly, Weatherman. Storms made to order." "Who would want to order a storm?" said Harry. "No one," said Mr. Brolly, "which is a pity, because I do love a good storm. Just think of it. Cracks of thunder, flashes of lightning. Are you sure you wouldn't like a storm? Just a small one?" But before Harry could answer, Mrs. Brolly came hurrying across the room and whisked Harry away to her bright and sunny kitchen. She sat down, smiled at Harry, and delved into her bag and brought out a patchwork quilt, just like the one on Harry's bed. "Fog and rain, wind and woe, that's all he ever thinks about," she said. Humming softly to herself, she began to stitch. From behind the kitchen door came the voice of Mr. Brolly. "Well, if I can't have a storm, I'll have fog. Misty, murky, mysterious fog." And from under the door, there began to creep little wisps and curls of fog. Mrs. Brolly didn't seem to notice and just stitched away at her quilt. Then the wisps became billows. "Mrs. Brolly, look!" shouted Harry. Mrs. Brolly looked up, saw the fog, and delving once more into her bag, she brought out 2 umbrellas with duck's head handles. The green eye of the duck on Harry's umbrella winked at him, and for a moment he thought he heard a soft quack, quack. But before he could examine this delightful object, Mrs. Brolly hurried him out into a garden which was full of sunflowers, and where rainbows arched across the sky. "What a beautiful garden! I didn't know you could have more than one rainbow," said Harry, and he and Mrs. Brolly hurried down the path. "Of course you can have more than one rainbow," said Mrs. Brolly. "You can have as many rainbows as you wish. People just think that there can only be one." Behind them, the fog was pouring from the kitchen door, hiding the garden from sight. It curled itself round their feet as they went, and then rose to Harry's knees. "Mrs. Brolly," said Harry, but again she seemed quite unconcerned. "Mr. Brolly thinks he makes the rainbows with his rain," she said, "but of course I make it with my sunshine." She opened her umbrella and rose some feet into the air above Harry's head. "Quick, quick, open your umbrella," she shouted. So Harry opened his umbrella and floated up to Mrs. Brolly's side. The fog swirled up around them, and Harry was a little alarmed. But Mrs. Brolly reached out and took his hand, and together they soared through the sky with some speed, clearing the bank of fog which rolled after them. Mr. Brolly and his fog, I'll show him sunshine, the like of which he's never seen before, said Mrs. Brolly. Umbrellas don't fly, said Harry. Magic umbrellas fly, said Mrs. Brolly. I didn't know there were any magic umbrellas, said Harry. There are only 3 in the whole wide world, said Mrs. Brolly. Yours and mine and Mr. Brolly's. Only 3? How lucky he was, thought Harry, to be the only child with a magic umbrella. With a magic umbrella, he could go anywhere. Where are we going, Mrs. Brolly? He said. Anywhere and everywhere, said Mrs. Brolly. And for the moment, her voice was soft and dreamy. We're the Brollys, she said. The Brollys make the weather, and there's weather all over the whole wide world. They came down beside a water hole. Mrs. Brolly sat down under a shady tree, took her patchwork quilt from her bag, and calmly began to stitch. Harry came down by the water hole, where a hippo lay, with a bird on its head. Close by, an elephant was drinking, and a brightly coloured snake lay basking on a rock. Mrs. Brolly, where are we? Asked Harry. In Africa, said Mrs. Brolly. Harry hung his umbrella on a branch of a tree and looked down at the scene. The sky was a brilliant blue, except for on the horizon where some wisps of cloud were drifting about. Mrs. Brolly, said Harry, I think it's going to rain. Rain? Rain? Trust Brolly to try and spoil everything, said Mrs. Brolly. I'll teach him a lesson. And she pointed her umbrella at the sky. The sun began to burn more fiercely than ever. And after a while, Harry saw that the plants round the waterhole had wilted, and that the waterhole itself was drying up. No, don't do that, Mrs. Brolly, said Harry. Let it rain a little. But Mrs. Brolly just went on stitching. Little by little, the waterhole shrank, until it was nothing more than a muddy puddle. And then that too began to disappear, and the earth began to crack. Puzzled, the animals stared at Harry. But what could he do to help? Mrs. Brolly, I think you're being cruel, said Harry. Cruel, said Mrs. Brolly, but it is the nature of the sun to be hot. Do you think that too much rain would be better? Please, Mr. Brolly, try to rain, shouted Harry. Try as hard as you can. And as he shouted, heavy clouds began to appear in the sky. Over the dry, burning desert they came like great galleons. But as they came, the sun shone all the brighter. And in no time at all, they were shriveled away to nothing. Aha! Cried Mrs. Brolly. Then in came the clouds again, heavier this time. Everything and everyone became still. Mrs. Brolly stopped stitching, and the animals stood close to Harry's side. Then came a flash of lightning, a clap of thunder, and the rain began to fall. Harder and harder it came, until the ground all around was sodden. It's raining! It's raining! The rain's come back! Shouted Harry. Everyone was so happy that they grunted and stamped, they danced and hissed, and flew around in little circles.
Mrs. Brolly, isn't this better? Said Harry. Everyone's happy. Is it? Said Mrs. Brolly. Are they?
And up through the raindrops she went, clutching her bag. Below, the waterhole filled to overflowing.
Stop! Shouted Harry. Stop the rain!
But it just rained harder than ever, until the water was up to his waist. The elephant lifted Harry up onto his back, where the snake lay with the bird nestled in his coils. With the hippo by his side, he clambered up onto a small island, and there they stood, with the water rising higher and higher, until suddenly, in the distance, Harry saw a small, ark-like boat.
Mr. Brolly! Mr. Brolly! He called. Please help us!
Soon the boat came bobbing by, and Harry and the animals climbed aboard.
Isn't this wonderful? Cried Mr. Brolly. No! Shouted Harry and the animals. Isn't it exhilarating? Cried Mr. Brolly. No! Said Harry. I want to go home. But my boy, said Mr. Brolly, you must enjoy it while you can. Why, I haven't had such a good storm for years. And he stood waving his arms like someone conducting an orchestra. And the boat whirled round as though it were in a whirlpool. Round and round and round it went.
Harry awoke with a start. It was morning, and the sun was shining through the window. Mrs. Brolly stood at the door of the weather house, a little lifeless figure made of wood. The animals were toys once more, but Harry knew that they were only waiting for the magic to come again. And it would come again, of that he was certain. For next to his bed leant the new umbrella, with the duck's head handle.
Quack,
it said softly to Harry, and it winked its eye.
Rainbows climb, clouds drift by, Brolys fly through a magic sky. Is this real? Are they dreams? Nothing appears to be what it seems. Then far away I can hear a voice in the weather house call out a name. Mr. Brolly, it's time for the rain.
Harry was trying to go to sleep, but no sooner had he closed his eyes than he opened them again. Tucked up beside Harry in bed were his toys, Elephant and Hippo. Snake, as always, lay on the rug by the door, and Bird was perched on the chest of drawers. Harry stared down at his patchwork quilt. It was different from other quilts. Instead of flowery scraps of material, it was made of little embroidered pictures of rainbows, stars and planets, clouds, and great flashes of lightning in a dark and stormy sky. It had been made a long, long time ago. On the wall hung Harry's weather house. If the day was going to be fine and sunny, Mrs. Brolly came to her door. If the day was going to be wet and cloudy, Mr. Brolly came out. But of course, they never came out together, for it is impossible for a day to be both wet and dry at the same time. But what would happen if they both came out together? Wondered Harry, and he sat up and stared at the weather house. As he stared, the doors seemed to grow larger. His bed grew smaller, and he found himself at the entrance of the weather house. A light was shining from the door, through which Harry could see Mr. Brolly no longer fixed to his wooden stand, but moving freely about the room. Harry was almost asleep when a great gust of wind came through his bedroom window and blew him into the weather house.
"There you are, my boy," said Mr. Brolly. "I thought that a good puff of wind would bring you. Why, I do believe that it's the only way to get anywhere at all. Get a good stiff breeze at your back, and off you go with a song in your heart and your hat blown off."
Harry, who was drifting round the room, smiled to think of everyone going about in this manner.
"But, my boy," said Mr. Brolly, "think of the convenience. Think of the exhilaration. One could get oneself blown to China, if one wished, or to the top of Kilimanjaro."
Harry came down by Mr. Brolly's computer screen. The pictures looked inviting, and he was just wondering if he preferred to go to China or to Kilimanjaro when the door opened and in marched Mrs. Brolly.
"Brolly," she said, "I have never heard such rubbish. Imagine blowing this innocent child to the top of one of the highest mountains in the world. The only thing a wind is good for is flying a kite. You may, with my permission, conjure up a nice little wind suitable for flying a kite."
With that, she took hold of Harry's hand and led him through the kitchen and out into the garden, where the animals sat enjoying the sun.
"But I haven't brought my kite,"
said Harry. Mrs. Brolly said nothing to this, but delved into her bag and brought out a big kite, which she handed to Harry. Then she opened her umbrella and rose in the air.
"Quick, open your brolly and off we go,"
she said.
"But what about the animals?" said Harry. "I don't want to leave them behind."
"Then you must keep in touch," said Mrs. Brolly. So Harry opened the duck's head umbrella and grabbed hold of Hippo's ear. To his surprise, the great animal rose from the path as lightly as if she were a balloon. Elephant took hold of her tail with his trunk, and the snake held on to Elephant's tail, and so they all went, as effortlessly as if in a dream, with a little bird flying by their side.
"Where are we going?"
shouted Harry. "You'll see," said Mrs. Brolly, and suddenly, there below them, was a park with high railings and a gate. It was the ideal place for flying a kite. Great lawns lay on either side, and there were small hills, just the right size for running up and getting a kite into the air. In the distance was a small bandstand. Mrs. Brolly sat down on a bench and began to stitch her patchwork quilt. Harry looked round. It was all very beautiful, he thought, but there was something not quite right. Hippo and Elephant were beginning to yawn, while the little bird and snake were already fast asleep on the branch of a tree.
"Mrs. Brolly," said Harry, "what's wrong with the park?"
But Mrs. Brolly just went on sewing. "Children should sometimes find things out for themselves," she said, and she didn't even look up. So Harry set off down the path, and he had not gone far when he realized that nothing in the park was moving. Not even a blade of grass was stirring. Then he turned a bend in the path and saw before him 3 small children, each child clutching a brightly coloured kite.
"We want to fly our kite, but there's no wind."
"I'm sorry," said Harry. "There's nothing I can do." But the children just gazed at him, as though there was something he could do. Harry began to whistle, as he had heard of whistling up a wind. But nothing at all happened, and his whistle sounded very thin and piping in the still, quiet park. By and by, he came back to where Mrs. Brolly sat sewing, and where the animals lay sleeping in the grass.
"Mrs. Brolly," said Harry, "there's no wind, and the children can't fly their kites."
"Well, it's all Brolly's fault," said Mrs. Brolly.
He's sulking again. If he can't have a high wind, he'll have no wind at all. That's Brolly all over. As she spoke, Harry saw Mr. Brolly coming down the path towards them, smiling the pleased and happy smile of someone who knows that they have been right all along. "You see, my dear," he said, "where there is no wind, there is no movement, no hustle and bustle, no coming and going, no—" "Be quiet," said Mrs. Brolly, "and make a wind at once. How dare you deprive these children of a day's fun?" "Very well," said Mr. Brolly, "but you do understand that what will move a kite will move other things as well." "Oh, get on with it," said Mrs. Brolly. So Mr. Brolly began to whistle. The blades of grass began to stir, the leaves of the trees began to rustle, and the children smiled as their kites rose into the air. Hippo and Elephant awoke. The little bird flew round in circles, and Snake woke up and fell out of the tree. In the bandstand, the band began to play, and altogether the park became alive with movement and joyful sound. "Isn't it wonderful?" said Mr. Brolly. "And it's all because of my old friend, the wind. Old Puff and Blow, I call him. Old Blow all before me. Old Brolly, Brolly," said Mrs. Brolly in a warning voice. But it was too late. The wind blew stronger and stronger, and up went the children, holding tight to the strings of their kites. Hippo and Elephant too were swept up by the strong gusts, and they flew past looking surprised, but rather pleased. "It's especially nice for a large animal to fly," said Mr. Brolly. "They are usually so firmly fixed on the ground, you see." Then he began to whistle more loudly, and the wind snatched the instruments from the bandsman's hands, and over the treetops they went, gleaming and playing a strange music all of their own. The bandsmen followed their instruments, each man holding on to his hat and to the boot of the man in front. Snake flew behind them, as straight as an arrow. "Isn't it wonderful?" cried Mr. Brolly. "Happiness, excitement, and all because of the wind." And indeed, everyone and everything in the park was tossing and swirling about in the gusts of wind, except for Mrs. Brolly. She, strangely enough, sat quite still on the bench and continued to stitch away at her patchwork quilt. "This wind wouldn't move her," said Mr. Brolly. "But there are different kinds of wind, dear boy. There's one that goes round and round and takes everything with it, even houses. Shall we try it?" "No," said Harry. "I don't think that people would like their houses to be blown round and round." "Don't you?" said Mr. Brolly. "I thought they might find it rather delightful, like living on a merry-go-round." "Mr. Brolly," said Harry, "stop the wind and put everything back where it was. It isn't fun anymore." "But my boy," said Mr. Brolly, "nothing can ever be put back exactly the way it was, you know. Once things have been stirred, they are never quite the same again." He seemed quite happy, until Mrs. Brolly rose up by his side and fixed him with a stern eye. "Brolly," she said, "stop this immediately." And at once the wind began to die down, little by little, until it was nothing more than a warm summer breeze. Gently, everyone and everything came down to earth. The bandsmen landed in a heap on the grass, and their instruments followed shortly afterwards, sighing and playing a little snatch of march or waltz. Hippo came down in the ornamental pond, where she felt quite at home, and where she astonished a water boatman. For a whole year he had skimmed back and forth across the pond, and now, suddenly before him was a large island. Elephant came down on top of the bandstand
and fell through the roof. The children smiled happily. It was the most exciting day that they had ever known. For why, it is wonderful to fly your kite. It is even more wonderful to fly with it. What are their names, Mrs. Brolly? But Mrs. Brolly had packed the quilt away in her bag, and already she was floating up and away, holding on to the handle of her umbrella. They don't have names, she said as she went. They're not real. They're just a dream. They aren't a dream, cried Harry. They're real children, just like me. Of course they are, said Mr. Brolly, appearing at Harry's side. But when Harry turned his head to look at the park, it didn't seem real at all, and like a painting where the colours have faded or run into one another. The children were nowhere to be seen. "Come back," he shouted. "We haven't had our picnic yet." And with that, he awoke and found himself sitting up in bed beneath his patchwork quilt. The animals had become toys again, but the wind was still blowing the curtains at his window. "I'm going to fly my kite today, Mrs. Brolly," he said. But Mrs. Brolly just stood at the door of the weather house, a small, still figure, made of wood.